You have been doing the 16-8 for 6 months. The window closes at 8 in the evening. You skip breakfast, and you have organized your entire morning around the feeling that you are doing something biologically significant during those fasting hours. And then someone tells you that their nutritionist said the window does not matter, that calories are all that counts, and that your fasting is producing exactly the same result as simply eating less food across the day. And now you are genuinely not sure whether the biology of your fast is real, or whether you have been making your mornings harder than they need to be for no additional return. Or you abandoned intermittent fasting because the hunger was genuinely unbearable and switched to caloric restriction and have been wondering ever since whether you made the metabolically worse choice. This video gives you the honest split verdict that most fasting content refuses to deliver. Not because one approach wins, but because they win in completely different categories. And knowing which categories belong to which approach changes everything about how you choose between them. Here is the finding that frames everything. A systematic review and meta-analysis published in ScienceDirect in 2024 examining 20 randomized controlled trials and comparing isocaloric intermittent fasting directly to caloric restriction at matched calorie deficits found that intermittent fasting produced significantly lower fasting blood insulin and significantly lower HOMA-IR in the long term compared to continuous caloric restriction at the same calorie deficit. Caloric restriction groups had significantly lower hunger scores, lower fatigue levels, and lower triglycerides. And a 2025 BMJ network meta-analysis of 99 trials produced the finding that will surprise most of the IF community. Only alternate-day fasting produced significantly greater weight loss than continuous caloric restriction. The popular 16-8 time-restricted eating that most people doing IF are actually practicing did not outperform continuous caloric restriction for weight loss when calories were matched. This distinction matters. Most people doing intermittent fasting are doing 16-8, not alternate-day fasting. And the evidence that their approach outperforms caloric restriction for weight loss when calories are equal does not exist in the current published literature. But weight loss is not the only outcome. And on the biological outcomes that are not weight loss, the story is meaningfully different. Here is the foundational biology that explains why two approaches producing similar caloric deficits can produce different biological outcomes. Caloric restriction reduces the total energy available to the body across the day by maintaining a consistent negative energy balance. It does not alter the hormonal environment at any specific point in the day. Insulin rises after every meal and falls between meals. The daily insulin pattern is essentially the same as in a person eating at maintenance, only at a lower calorie level. mTOR is activated after every meal. Autophagy runs partially during the gaps between meals in a continuous eating pattern. The biological machinery of the fasted state runs at full depth for a significant portion of every day, not the partial fasted state of the gaps between meals in a continuous eating pattern. The genuine fasted state that produces the molecular benefits most people chose intermittent fasting to access. Think of continuous caloric restriction as a factory running at 60% capacity all day. Calorie deficit is achieved by reducing the total production volume. Think of intermittent fasting as a factory running at full capacity for part of the day and completely shutting down for the rest. Calorie deficit is achieved by the shutdown period rather than a continuous reduction. The total output across the day may be similar, but the shutdown period activates the maintenance crew that the continuous 60% factory never turns on completely because production never fully stops. Where intermittent fasting wins. The most important biological category where intermittent fasting produces measurably superior outcomes to caloric restriction at matched calories is insulin sensitivity and the downstream metabolic markers that depend on it. The systematic review of 20 isocaloric RCTs confirmed that intermittent fasting produced significantly lower fasting blood insulin and significantly lower HOMA-IR in the long term compared to continuous caloric restriction at the same calorie deficit. This finding is mechanistically explained by the depth of the insulin nadir that the extended fasting window produces. In continuous caloric restriction, insulin never falls below the partial fasted level between smaller meals. The genuine insulin baseline, the level at which hormone-sensitive lipase is fully activated and the liver's fat oxidation program runs at maximum, is only reached after a fasting window of approximately 12 hours or more. People eating 3 smaller meals across a 12-hour day never reach this baseline between their meals. Their insulin is chronically lowish rather than genuinely minimal. Intermittent fasting extends the window of genuine insulin minimum. HOMA-IR improvement follows directly. The second category where intermittent fasting wins is cellular autophagy. The research is unambiguous on this point. A fasting window of 12 to 16 hours or more produces a depth of autophagic flux that the partial fasting between meals in a continuous eating pattern does not replicate. A 2025 prospective human study published in Clinical Nutrition ESPN found that dawn-to-dusk intermittent fasting significantly upregulated the expression of autophagic-related genes LAMP2, LC3B, and ATG5, while improving inflammatory and metabolic markers. These are the specific molecular markers of the autophagic program running at depth. Research by Matson and colleagues at the National Institute on Aging established that the duration of the fasting window is the primary determinant of autophagic activation, with the genuine mTOR suppression required for full autophagic depth requiring 12 or more consecutive hours without nutrient arrival. Reducing calories without extending that window does not produce the same autophagic activation because mTOR is never fully suppressed between smaller meals. The third category where intermittent fasting shows an advantage is circadian biology alignment. The research on time-restricted eating and circadian clock gene synchronization described in the morning walking script in this series applies here. When eating is confined to a defined window that aligns with the body's circadian metabolic expectations, the peripheral organ clocks in the liver, gut, and adipose tissue remain synchronized with the central circadian clock. Extended eating windows that spread caloric intake across 12 to 16 waking hours without a defined fasting period produce circadian misalignment in peripheral organ clocks that continuous caloric restriction also does not address. A 2025 RCT published in the Annals of Internal Medicine found that 4-3 intermittent fasting produced nearly 3 kilograms more weight loss than daily caloric restriction over 12 months, even without strict calorie matching in the fasting group. The adherence dimension of this finding matters. Intermittent fasting shows better short-term adherence than continuous caloric restriction in most studies. The rigid daily calorie tracking that continuous caloric restriction requires is psychologically demanding across months and years in ways that the binary eating window rule of intermittent fasting is not. The biology of both approaches is irrelevant if one of them is abandoned after 6 weeks. Where caloric restriction wins. The most important biological category where continuous caloric restriction produces superior outcomes to intermittent fasting is muscle protein synthesis and lean mass preservation. This is the finding that intermittent fasting advocates most frequently underestimate and that the research has established clearly enough to deserve direct and honest treatment. Muscle protein synthesis is driven by 2 things: the mechanical signal of resistance training and the leucine-mediated amino acid signal through mTORC1 in the hours following protein ingestion. Critically, muscle protein synthesis saturates at approximately 0.25 grams per kilogram of body weight of high-quality protein in a single meal. For a 70-kilogram person, this means approximately 17 to 18 grams of protein per sitting provides the saturating leucine dose for that eating occasion. Beyond that threshold, additional protein in the same sitting is oxidized for energy rather than directed toward additional muscle protein synthesis. This is the muscle full effect. After peak MPS is reached, approximately 1 to 3 hours after protein ingestion, the MPS rate returns to baseline even if plasma amino acid levels remain elevated. The muscle cannot be re-stimulated for further synthesis for 3 to 5 hours regardless of additional protein intake. The consequence for intermittent fasting is specific and significant. If the daily protein requirement of 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight for muscle maintenance and growth must be consumed within a 6 to 8 hour eating window, a large proportion of that protein arrives in 2 or 3 closely spaced large meals. Each large protein bolus stimulates MPS once. The muscle full effect means the second and third boluses arriving within the same compressed window before the refractory period has passed produce less additional MPS than they would have if consumed after a full 3 to 5 hour gap. The total daily leucine signal delivered to mTORC1 for muscle protein synthesis is lower in a compressed eating window than in a distributed protein intake pattern across the full day. Research published in Clinical Nutrition in September 2024 examined integrated rates of muscle protein synthesis in middle-aged males with overweight during alternate day fasting compared to continuous caloric restriction and a control diet. The research confirmed that energy restriction itself reduces muscle protein synthesis rates in both the fasted and fed state. But the protein distribution across the feeding period remains the key variable determining how much of the available daily protein is converted into new muscle tissue versus the fraction that arrives during the muscle full refractory period and is oxidized for energy instead. Continuous caloric restriction with protein intake distributed across 3 to 4 meals with 3 to 5 hour gaps between them, each providing 30 to 40 grams of protein, produces the optimal daily leucine signal delivery pattern for maximum muscle protein synthesis. Intermittent fasting, with protein compressed into a 6 to 8 hour window, requires significantly more intentional protein distribution management to approach the same outcome. For older adults specifically, where the anabolic resistance of aging muscle means more protein per sitting is required to trigger the same MPS response as in younger muscle, the protein distribution problem of a compressed eating window is more consequential than it is for younger adults. The second category where continuous caloric restriction shows an advantage is hunger management and psychological sustainability across the day. The isocaloric systematic review of 20 RCTs comparing IF and CR confirmed that caloric restriction groups reported significantly lower hunger scores and lower fatigue levels than intermittent fasting groups. Restricting calories without restricting eating hours allows smaller meals across more time points, reducing the intensity of the hunger peaks that a compressed eating window produces. For people who experience significant hunger during the fasting window as a barrier to sustained adherence, the distributed eating pattern of caloric restriction is biologically kinder to the appetite regulation system. The third category where caloric restriction shows a modest advantage is triglyceride reduction. The same systematic review confirmed that caloric restriction groups achieved significantly lower triglycerides than isocaloric intermittent fasting groups. The mechanism relates to the hepatic fat metabolism during the eating period. When a larger proportion of daily calories arrives in a compressed window, the postprandial lipemia from each larger meal is more pronounced than it would be from smaller distributed meals, producing a higher daily area under the triglyceride curve even at the same total calorie intake. The honest verdict: intermittent fasting wins for insulin sensitivity, HOMA-IR improvement, autophagic depth, circadian alignment, and for people whose primary adherence barrier is calorie tracking. Continuous caloric restriction wins for muscle protein synthesis in people who optimize protein distribution across meals, hunger management across the day, triglyceride reduction, and for people whose primary adherence barrier is the hunger of an extended fasting window. The combination of both wins for almost every outcome simultaneously. Early time-restricted eating with an 8-hour window aligned with morning and afternoon, combined with a moderate caloric deficit and protein distributed across 2 to 3 meals with sufficient spacing, produces the insulin sensitivity and autophagic depth of IF and the protein distribution and triglyceride reduction advantages of caloric restriction simultaneously. Here is the honest framing. The 2024 systematic review of 20 isocaloric RCTs comparing IF and CR is published in ScienceDirect. The 2025 BMJ network meta-analysis of 99 trials is published. The 2025 Annals of Internal Medicine 4.3 IF versus caloric restriction RCT is published. The Clinical Nutrition September 2024 IF and Muscle Protein Synthesis Study is published. The Clinical Nutrition ESPEN 2025 IF and Autophagy Gene Upregulation Study is published. The muscle full effect and 0.25 grams per kilogram saturating dose threshold is established across decades muscle physiology research. The honest caveat is this. The research comparing intermittent fasting to caloric restriction includes enormous heterogeneity in fasting protocols, eating window durations, calorie matching between groups, population ages, baseline fitness levels, and study durations. The findings described above are the most consistent patterns across the literature. Individual responses to each approach vary significantly, and the best approach for any individual is the one that produces the most consistent adherence over months and years, rather than the one that produces the superior acute biological response over a 6-week study. Here is the complete picture. Intermittent fasting produces a deeper insulin nadir, more complete autophagic activation, and superior circadian clock alignment. Caloric restriction produces better daily protein distribution for muscle protein synthesis, lower daily hunger, better triglycerides. Neither choice was wrong. Both choices were targeting real biological outcomes through the person who chooses based on which specific outcome they most urgently need is making a more scientifically informed decision than the person who chooses based on which camp has the more compelling online following. Drop a comment right now. Which approach are you currently using, and which of the split verdict findings most changed how you think about why you chose it? I read every single one. If this permanently changed how you think about the comparison between intermittent fasting and caloric restriction and which biological outcomes each one actually wins, hit subscribe. Every week on the Rewired, we decode the mechanisms behind the habits that determine your health, your brain, and how you age. New mechanism every week. You came to this video with a specific question. Whether the biology of your 16/8 fast is real, or whether you have been making your mornings harder than they need to be for no additional return, or whether abandoning IF for caloric restriction was the metabolically worse choice. The honest answer is that both questions have the same answer. The biology of the fasting window is real, and it wins specific outcomes that caloric restriction at the same calories does not produce. Insulin sensitivity, autophagic depth, circadian alignment. Those are the genuine returns on your harder mornings. But if the hunger of the fasting window broke you, the caloric restriction you switch to wins specific outcomes that IF does not produce as efficiently. Muscle protein synthesis with distributed intake, lower daily hunger, better triglycerides. Neither choice was wrong. Both choices were targeting real biological outcomes through the mechanism each approach most specifically activates. The only genuinely suboptimal choice is picking one approach based on camp loyalty rather than on which biological outcome you most urgently need.